Hello and welcome to the Choralosophy Podcast. This is episode 96, Real Men Sing with Braeden Ayres. Dr. Ayres is a teacher, conductor, and composer with a passion point that I share, as you'll hear later, related to concepts of masculinity in choral music. What stereotypes are we stuck to? What challenges do we face when discussing this topic? And what are the best ways to engage young adolescent boys in our school programs? We discussed some of the findings from his dissertation research on this topic, as well as simply brainstorming ways to recruit and retain boys without pandering to preconceived ideas of masculinity. We discussed the changing voice. We discussed concepts of gender expression and gender identity, the spectrum that is of sexuality that is showing up in our classes of boys and girls, and a variety of other things tangential to this topic that I think will be helpful for any teacher or conductor trying to think their way through this delicate topic and important topic as we face a situation in the U.S. and probably many countries around the world face this similar situation, that getting boys to sing in our choirs is much harder than getting girls to sing and to stay. Some show a disparity of 2 or 3 or 4, maybe 5 times the number of girls in their programs as boys. So this is an important topic, and one that is not as simple as just say, well, let's do more sea shanties. So I think you'll enjoy this episode. Stick around. The production costs of the Choralosophy Podcast are underwritten by the supporters at Patreon. Patreon.com/Choralosophy is the place where the MVPs of the Choralosophy audience and the Cool Kids Club hang out and get the behind-the-scenes scoop on the show with a private podcast feed, as well as offer financial and moral support for as little as $3 a month. The producers at Patreon are Brannigan Lawrence, Vasquez Academy of Music, John Warner, Ulrika Igrain Munoz Alarcon, Angie Schilling, Chandler Smith, David Kowalczyk, Jeff Wall, Kyle Peterson, Michael Herron, Ryan Main, and Steve and Kathy Kakachik. Here's Braeden Ayres. All right, everybody, I'm here with Braeden Ayres, and we are going to be talking about one of his passion topics, which is also one of my passion topics, which is masculinity in choral music, or for those of us in the Toxic Masculine Club, bro choir. Okay, we're gonna be talking about a lot of aspects that relate to that. And so, Braeden, welcome to the show.
Well, hi. Thanks so much for having me. It's really great to be here.
Yeah. Well, when you
Pleasure.
suggested this topic, I got really excited because, of course, I'm a high school choir teacher, my day job, and one of the banes of our existence teaching high school is getting kids, boys in particular, to want to
Yeah.
sing.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. How many, I'm not familiar actually with the size of your program and the ratio. Do you have any idea
Yeah,
what
we're
that looks
about
like for you right now?
90 boys and about 150 girls. About 95, 145, something like that.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah. So, let's crunch those numbers. 90, 150 over 90. Because
you're
the
doing math.
national average, according to our recent the most recent studies that we have, is that there's a ratio of 7-to-1, or
Wow.
seven girls to 3, or not 7-to-1, 7-to-3. I'm sorry. So
Okay.
basically that rate that turns out for like 2-to-1, a little more than 2-to-1. For every one boy you can have 2 or more girls. So you're actually doing pretty well, actually,
Yep.
compared to that kind of
And yeah, now
national
it's
average.
interesting that you bring up the math from your study because we're going to talk about that more later. But I knew we were doing pretty well compared to the typical place. And of course, it's a passion though, because for me, because I am a male and I grew up singing. My mother was a choir director. I never quite, but of course, I also did like I was joking before, very masculine things like play sports, and I did all those things, and I was able to fill into all of the stereotypes, but still loved singing in choir.
Yeah.
And so there was a cultural connection for me, but a lot of the boys that I meet and that I teach don't have that. And of course, as you
Yeah.
just hinted at, nationwide, we don't have that by and large. So why don't you tell us a little bit first about you, who you are, and how you came to care about this topic so much?
Sure. Yeah. Well, right now I teach. I live and work in rural Illinois. But before that, I started my career teaching middle school choir and high school choir at a school in Colorado Springs, where I was there for about 5 years, and it was a K-12 campus that had arts people at every level. It was really large, like 2,000 kids from K to 12, all on one big school, like a mall. And so I got to watch a lot of kids kind of go through that in the time that I was there, and I started working with middle schoolers. And really became enamored with working with that age group after initially resisting it. So my mother was also a choir director,
Mm-hmm.
or was a what did you say your mom does?
She
Did?
she was a choir director, mostly
Yeah,
church,
yeah, yeah,
elementary.
yeah. So was my mom. My mom is a retired choir director, but I had that connection for myself as well.
Right.
And I always swore that middle school was the age that I was absolutely never going to teach
Yeah.
because I saw how awful it was and how terrible they were. Of course, this is me from my outsider perspective. And then, of course, like you do after you finish your undergrad, you take the jobs that are available. And I found myself teaching middle school choir at this big campus. And the more I worked with that age group, the more I was like, oh, wait, hang on a second. There's actually something really fun happening here. And I started really getting interested in working and specializing with that age group. And so even going through my graduate degrees and stuff, I've always had a special emphasis on developmental choirs and developing singers as a music educator and as a composer. Uh, uh, that's why I did my dissertation topic on this age group, specifically early adolescent males, so middle school boys,
Uh-huh.
because I felt like there were just so many things about the way we are taught to teach boys and the ways we are sort of enculturated to think about boys that were I'll say unhelpful is the most the nicest thing that I could say. There's a lot of things that the way that we teach boys and do that I think was worth examining. And so that's what I did my dissertation on. Ultimately, I studied a bunch of looked at over 1,000 pieces of choral music for middle school boys, boiled them down to the top 100 kind of best of, and then I looked at all of those according to not just the components of range, like how high or low each individual voice part is across all these things, but I also looked at the textual and emotional components, as well as the theoretical concepts, rhythms, keys, harmonies, that sort of thing,
Yeah.
and really tried to get a glimpse of what the repertoire looks like
Right.
for these.
That's great. That's fascinating. Let's go back to a couple things that you said. So, when you say that there are some unhelpful ways that we're taught to think about boys and teach boys, well,
Yeah.
give us some examples.
Well, I think one of the first things that we do when we look at this, say gender disparity in our programs, let's say we have so many sopranos and altos and we don't have enough tenors and basses. Um, there's a lot of things about that. Just right off the bat, what is it about the fact that we have more sopranos and altos and tenors and basses that means our program, first of all, is anyway deficient? I think we can learn to make music and select repertoire that fits our students, even if we don't have a balanced, soprano, alto, tenor, bass choir.
Right.
And that's what many really successful people do across, the country. We make do with what we have. Um, but then when we start to think, okay, beyond that, let's say I really do, I want to have a balanced ensemble, and that's fine. That's a valid thing to want. How we go about recruiting and engaging with boys to get them in the door, and the things that we do, they tend to be kind of based in a lot of ways not on research and what we actually know about boys and adolescents, but sort of based on this kind of common sense knowledge that's been passed down from generation to generation, choir director to choir director. And I think the first thing that we have to think about is this idea that because we need tenors and basses, we need to appeal to the masculinity of boys.
Okay.
Right? I think one of the things that is challenging about living and working in contemporary American society is this idea that our whole culture is divided into boys and girls, and anything which sort of blurs that binary or which doesn't fit neatly into, well, girls like this and boys like this. Sometimes people in our society will struggle with that because it's what's called gender incongruent. So singing is not an innately male or female thing,
Of course. Right.
right?
Hmm.
When we talk about making music, I don't think, I want to make music because it expresses and affirms my gender. That may be a part of it for some of the music that I sing, and there may be people for whom that is true, but that's not one of the core things about singing,
Right.
right? Music is inherently good for so many things, but at its base, gender is not one of them, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Let me
and
kind of
yet,
go.
we so often will start at that point when we are looking at being deficient in boys.
Right. This episode comes out in March, which means that there is still time for you to get your Sight Reading Factory memberships for you and your kids. You've got a final exam coming up and you don't have Sight Reading Factory yet, you are missing the boat. You can test each of your students individually according to their level and according to what is appropriate for their development. And I strongly encourage you to incorporate that tool. Of course, you can check back through the podcast feed for many episodes where I outline different ways to use Sight Reading Factory. Of course, you can also use your Choreolosophy checkout there. You can use your Choreolosophy checkout code there to get 10% off. Plus, you can head over to mymusicfolders.com and get the Resonant Singer's Mask, top-of-the-line choir folders, and a variety of other types of choir gear, and also use Choreolosophy at checkout to get a discount. Right. Now, just 1 second. So, all right. So,
Yeah.
just before we get too far into that, so I'm trying to picture how this would go in if I'm recruiting boys. To me, my first instinct is to think that wouldn't it depend on the boy?
Yeah,
In
exactly.
in other words, if you're going to appeal to some type of a stereotype of gender, then you could just as well alienate certain boys. But at the same time, um, if you ignore what is, I guess, for lack of a better term, traditional masculinity, you would also
Mhm.
alienate a lot of boys because
Yeah.
because many boys, I mean, statistically, the vast majority, in the neighborhood of 97% or so of males, identify with all types of masculine traits. So,
That's interesting.
you know, and so to me, it's a question of getting to know the individual kid,
Yeah.
um, because you're right, there are all kinds of blurry lines.
Yep.
So anyway, just thought I'd throw
And
that in
the
there.
fact is, according to, I think, the most recent, the Gallup data we had from about 10 years ago showed that like 1 in 22 kids identified as LGBT in some
Right.
way. That was 10 years ago. And then they just released a survey that finalized about like a year ago. And that number has jumped to like 1 in 5. So the
Hmm.
fact is, we have a large number of kids for whom that LGBT like umbrella
Right.
encompasses so many things, right? But one of the unifying traits of that is a non-identification with this really rigid gender binary. So I know, there are a lot of people for whom those things are really important, but they're not the only thing. So exactly like you said, it's got to be about meeting the students where they're at.
Yep. Yep.
And yet, for generations, we have many, many, many studies which show when we talk about how to train teachers and recruit boys, it's all back to rugged masculinity. They want to sing sea shanties. They want to sing masculine, virile things. One author even wrote, no self-respecting man would ever want to sing about clouds and rainbows. And and I think, well, that's interesting. There's a whole lot to unpack in all of those different things. Uh, but if we believe that singing is for all people, why would we base all of our recruiting efforts for this, 50% of the population based on, old stereotypes from like 100 years old at
Yeah.
this point.
Yeah.
I think there's so much more about singing that we can appeal to rather than just it's a great place to meet girls.
Yep.
It could be,
It
but
it
there
is
are
for a
there
lot
are
of
many
kids.
people for whom that, yeah,
It is
but
for
there
a
are
lot of
many
kids.
many other things that
Right.
are good about singing, and I
Y-
think if that's one of the things that I hope that people focus on.
or a place for boys to meet boys.
Yeah,
And
yeah, it could be that too.
you know,
But that's a new one. That's not a thing that you have heard a
no,
lot.
no, but it's the reality of the time, right? And
Hmm.
as you said, those types of things are our kids are becoming more and more comfortable with those
Yeah,
things, and that's wonderful. So
yeah.
and so I'm going to throw out a couple things, and I'm not sure if you included this in your study. I have skimmed through it, but I have not read the entire thing. Apologies.
Oh, it's
Um,
very long and boring. It's okay.
and I'll put it in the show notes so people can look at it.
Oh, good.
But one of the things that I find interesting too is, in my experience working with boys, is that there are certain things that transcend. I'm going to choose that word, transcend the the concept of identity in terms of
Mm,
sexuality and where they
mhm.
fall on a masculine spectrum, and they fall into the realm of biology because
Mm,
having to do with how the voice is changing and
yeah.
what types of sensations they are feeling in their body when they sing for the first time. So, for example, I've discovered that boys, and I don't care if they're gay or straight, boys in ninth grade love to just sing big, loud C major chords.
Yeah,
Okay, because of where it sits in their voice, and they get to feel their chest voices rumble for the first time. They get to
yeah.
hear how their new quote unquote man voice sounds with the overtone spectrum being engaged in within their hearing range, which is something that is kind of
Mhm,
unique to male voices.
mhm.
And so there's a certain aspect of that where maybe the dearth or the kind of, or I guess the deficiency in the repertoire is that a lot of times to get, and I just picked C major not because it's magic, but just as a stereotype. Um,
Yeah.
but where a lot of that, maybe you find that in sea shanties, and we need to find that in some more other repertoire,
Yeah. Yeah.
those types
Yeah,
of things.
I think it's definitely, there's no doubt that, listen, I I have an arrangement of Wellerman out there.
Okay, yeah,
I'm not going to say that sea shanties are bad, right?
right.
But what is it about those songs that is good, right? Let's talk about their musical content.
Uh-huh.
We love that they tell stories. We love that they are funny sometimes. We love that they're often very tuneful, and so they're easy to learn. They're easy to sing.
Yep.
We love that they have, in the case of, like, if you're talking about those great Parker Shaw sea shanty arrangements, they're really well crafted a lot of times. So they take that musical material and find interesting ways to vary it so they feel like kind of substantial
Mm-hmm.
repertoire. All of that I think is fantastic, right?
Yeah. Yep.
But where in there is there something that says anything about my gender?
Right.
Sometimes it's in the text. Sometimes it's in the text,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a part of it.
Yeah.
But can we get music that has other interesting textual elements that have nothing to do with gender, but then hit all of the other criteria? Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yep. Yeah. Another thing with sea shanties is they are short phrases.
Yeah.
And that
Very
is
singable.
very helpful for boys who in puberty where the vocal folds have doubled approximately in size within the last year or whatever, and it takes quite a bit
Hmm.
of energy for them to just get the folds touching and moving, let
Yes.
alone to sing this long 8 measure phrase that's got some looping melodic material or sustained. I'm doing, for example, I'm doing Lauridsen's "Sure on This Shining Night," the TTBB right now
Oh, that.
with my boys, but the own yep, uh-huh. Now my
Hmm.
younger boys, they can't do that by themselves. They for this project they're collaborating with the senior boys, and so
Oh, very good.
with their help they can do that, but by themselves they wouldn't be able to do that.
Sure.
And so there's a certain again. So I keep coming back to the vocal pedagogical aspect of it
Yeah.
too, where there are unique, and of course this, but there are unique demands and unique needs for that male puberty voice, that I think you're right.
Absolutely.
Figuring out
Yeah. And
things
I
that are
think
that
I
yeah.
think, frankly, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to
No, just
interrupt.
figuring out things that
Uh,
aren't sea shanties for that would be
yeah.
great.
Yeah. Well, it's also documented in the research that part of the reason we fall back on some of this gender stuff is frankly because we don't have the expertise we need to really be addressing the vocal needs of these students, right?
Hmm.
So because we as teachers, and this is not anyone's fault except for the fact that there's too much to cover in an undergrad music education degree already,
Yep.
right? There's only so many things that you can do, but we are not specialists unless we seek it out in the male changing voice.
Yep.
And it is a really difficult process. Uh, you know, Students, whether, and it's hard for everyone because the boys who have grown up loving to sing, all of a sudden they feel like their voice is broken and they start to encounter issues of self-esteem and like, why am I even doing this? I can't, I'm bad at singing now. And, many boys quit and never come back,
Uh-huh.
right? On the other hand, the boys who never learned how to sing, well, they don't get any training in their changing voice, and they literally never use how they never learn how to use it. And so you have these men walking around, grown adults, who have absolutely no concept of how to use their voice in any sort of musical way. So training boys how to work that transition, I think, is one of the best things that we can do, because if we believe that singing is for all people and that all people should be singing, that shouldn't include, 25% of the boys in our country. It should be, everybody should be singing.
Hmm.
And the best thing we can do for that is not pander to some sort of masculine stereotype, but to go, hey, you are a mid voice 2A, and let me show you exactly where on John Cooksey's chart you fall in this voice change process. And look, over the next couple of weeks, you start to expect that you're going to lose some of your lower notes and your range is going to shrink for a little bit. And then watch, though, over the course of this school year, and we can track it for you in class. You're going to see your range expanding. That kind of knowledge about how the voice actually works
Yep.
is infinitely more empowering than we're gonna sing sea shanties.
Yeah. Right.
I think, because there's so much more you can do with it.
Of course. Yeah, of course. No, I agree. And I think the where I get into a little bit of a challenge with this is just that I believe, and maybe this is radical, but I believe
Mm,
that you can make space in a choral rehearsal, especially with this. I have groups of ninth grade, mostly boys,
mhm.
and that you can make room for the kids and the boys that do very strongly identify with strongly traditional masculine
Yeah.
concepts.
Well,
And
there should be a place for everyone in the choir.
yes, exactly. While
Yeah.
also not excluding the
Yeah.
boys that don't. I think you can actually very easily do both if the or both is not even the right word. That plus all of the other things,
Yeah.
right? All of that.
Yeah,
Well,
I love that.
yeah,
How do you do that? What do you think that looks like for you?
getting to know the individual kid as soon as possible.
Yeah.
Asking them questions. Oh, you play sports? You play baseball? Oh, yeah, I used to do that too. Does your dad coach you? My dad used to coach me. Having conversations where you show interest in the kid,
Right.
and that is a process, and it takes a lot of, it takes work and it takes intentionality,
Mm,
and it can't be done with a snap of a finger. It's an investment of time,
right.
to where you start to gauge quickly. And I've been doing it for 20 years, and so you gauge quickly what types of kids you have in your room and what
Mm,
combination of, I guess, personality types, and also where kids fall in the gender spectrum. And of course, when you're
yeah.
talking about ninth graders, oftentimes you do have kids that are still trying to figure stuff out.
Oh, of course.
And
Of
and that's
course.
a
Yeah.
part of it too. But if you can, as a teacher, if you can make a kid in any situation at least just know that you're interested in who they are, then that can become a safe place to even experiment, and
Yeah.
and just making all kinds of things um, safe in
Yeah.
that kind of a room.
Exactly. And I think you've hit the nail on the head. It's not necessarily about excluding or preferring one thing or the other, but about expanding what is acceptable.
Yes.
You know,
Yep.
because the fact is, we do live in a society which has in some areas very rigid expectations for gender,
Mm-hmm.
and those who deviate from it, it's very rare, I'll say, for your you know rugged man's man to actually face any sort of negative repercussions for being who they are,
Yeah.
right? But for a boy to walk down the street wearing nail polish, he can get suspended, he can get beat up. um, and we as teachers have to say, hang on, is that going to be the culture in my room?
Mm-hmm.
No, I think, and that's we can't change society as a whole. And while I wish that I could go out and make everything better for everyone, all I can do is affect the culture that is in my space.
Right.
And also, I think when you talk about meeting kids where they're at, recognize that not every choir is going to be the same. I'm sure with just in terms of their voices, you've got years where I've got a ton of tenors and unchanged voices, and so we have to do completely different repertoire than the year before when I had this huge crop of basses.
Right.
It's the exact same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's I've got this little saying that I like to throw out every once in a while, which is that um, that you can't actually be inclusive at all
Mm.
while while excluding anything, right? So there has to be there has to be an effort to, and that's why I keep coming back to the individual. I've done episodes on this before where that until we know all of our singers, then we aren't really being inclusive, because you can't make guesses based on even sexuality. Like you might know that a kid in your classroom is gay or that they're trans, but you still
Right.
don't know. That's like that's a layer of the onion. Uh,
Well, exactly.
yeah,
That would be like saying, Beyonce, sh all she brings to the table is that she's a black artist.
right.
It's like, no,
No.
she's an incredible artist who has done so many interesting things, and that is a facet,
Hmm.
an important facet, I would say, if you know her work, right? But it's a part of who they are. And it's the same thing with your kids. If they are interested in sports or they are interested in knitting, like that's a piece of
Yeah.
who they are.
Yep.
And there's so much more to them.
Yep, absolutely. And I think on the recruiting side of it, I think that is you're right in that if anytime we try to cater to a particular stereotype of any kind, we run the risk of, like I said before, excluding by the attempt of including.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Where we're going to present uh, all types of things. If you join this choir, you're going to present all types of music from all types of places, and it's welcome to all people, which is something that I actually don't believe that you can convince people of without just showing them.
Yeah.
Like just say, like making a poster and hanging on your door, that doesn't do it.
Yes.
It's
I think, yeah, you're hitting to my philosophy, I think, which is that the culture of your room and the way you do things in the day to day is the strongest recruitment tool you
yep.
have.
Yep. Not what you post on
It's
Instagram. Like,
Yep.
it's, it's, they don't care
Because
about that.
word travels,
Right.
kids find out, they're like, hey, you need to be in choir, and they
Hmm.
go, why? And then
Yep.
in the hallway, they'll
Yep.
they'll they'll recruit for you if your space is a good space for them.
Yep.
As if they feel safe and they want their friends to be there, like
Yeah.
that's it.
Yep. If you work,
That's
if
it.
in my room is if you're willing to do the work that it takes to become a good singer, then you are highly valued.
Yeah.
And they kids who want to recruit each other, it's on that basis. Hey, we're going to be really good. You should come join.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. And so I think that's really important. Now, I'm looking at your table of contents here because there's a couple other topics that I see that I would love to talk about.
Oh
What
yeah.
you've got a section in here which are specifically on the challenges of adolescent males. And you've got a physiological, a neurological, and sociological category in here. Could you tell us a little bit about some of those things that you have written about and studied about that are kind of unique to this age group?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, when we're talking about the changing voice, the first thing that we have to understand is that the voice obviously changes beginning at puberty. And this is for males, females, trans folk. Everybody actually goes through a voice change from childhood into adulthood. The voice change in cisgender females is much subtler, but it does exist, and there's a whole fascinating body of research out there on that right now.
Yep.
My dissertation specialized, like I said, on cisgender males. So a lot of these principles you can take and apply to working with other types of voices. Um, but the main principles of the voice change are the actual mechanism by which you sing and phonate is undergoing a physical transformation.
Yeah.
And so it would be akin to trying to play a violin and build it at the same time.
Uh-huh.
It is that difficult because we talk about all the challenges that kids encounter physiologically with puberty, the zits in the hair and the body odor, and that's all you know separate from what's going on in their vocal mechanism, which is that, like you said, the larynx can double in size, sometimes at an extremely rapid rate.
Uh-huh.
Um, and when that happens, the vocal folds, because they're growing, they're much more easily fatigued. So I'm sure you've noticed with your younger developing singers, they get tired much more easily.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the things that I had to learn first off when I started teaching. I couldn't do the same type of structure in my classroom working with those middle schoolers than I could in my high school, because the high school kids could go for longer and not need breaks. My middle schoolers, I learned to time things so that, if they're singing for a large chunk of time, we've got an activity coming up where they're going to get to rest their voices for a few minutes, and then we'll go back to singing again.
Right.
Maybe we'll mix in some literacy stuff. And that kind of variation also helps us with those neurological needs of those middle
Mm-hmm.
school boys. So getting back to that, um, the fundamental characteristic of all adolescence is that the front of the brain is disconnected from the back of the brain. So the front of the brain is the part that is doing all of our rational thinking, higher order processing. If I do this, then this will happen, then that will happen, cause and effect.
Mm-hmm.
Back of the brain is what we call kind of your lizard brain, and that is where your basic needs, like I'm hungry, I'm tired, I'm thirsty, animal instincts. Middle schoolers have a functional disconnect between those two parts of the brain. So this is why when you're working with younger kids, you'll ask them, like, what were you thinking? Why did you spray paint your name on the wall in the middle of this DSE rehearsal? You're like, well, I wasn't thinking. I was bored, or I was, blah, 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 blah. And it's not their fault. It's because literally the brain is under construction. We've got two roads on either side of town, and we don't have a bridge to connect them. So there's no way for me to mediate the fact that I'm tired and grumpy, and so I need to act better so that I don't cause a disturbance in the classroom. They're not fully capable of moderating their behavior at all times.
Mm-hmm.
What we know is that boys are socialized for that type of acting out to be more acceptable than girls. Girls from a young age are kind of socialized to sit and be quiet and wait, whereas boys will be boys is the expression, right? We kind of let them do whatever they want. And it's a matter of debate in the scholarly community whether that is primarily a difference in how we socialize kids or a difference in neurology. However, the research is pretty clear that when we look at almost all factors, with the exception of language processing, girls tend to outperform boys in language processing tasks, and boys will sometimes tend to outperform girls in motory tasks.
Mm-hmm.
Other than those two factors, we find more difference within sexes than we find without.
Yep.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Just like with race.
yes.
That's true within races, and
Yes.
there's
Yes.
more genetic diversity within the continent of Africa than on the rest of the planet.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. But when we know that about kids, well, okay, I know that boys need to be physical. This is true,
Yeah.
right? If we're talking about cisgender boys, they need to be moving. They cannot be sitting still. When I work with young kids, I try and structure it so that we are never doing anything for more than 7 minutes at a time.
Mm-hmm.
We have, a warm up, and we do that on the risers, and then we're all going to go over here. We're going to sit on the floor and look at the whiteboard to do our rhythm reading, and then get your eyes up here for the projector. Stand up. We're going to do sight singing with our hand signs. Okay, everybody, back on the risers. Before I know it, a half hour has gone by, and they've been in 4 different places, and they've had the chance to get up and move, and it unlocks so much in them because they don't have that kind of nervous energy,
Right.
right? That I think is a really good way to cater to the needs of boys that is actually backed by research.
Yeah. Yeah, now I'm gonna jump in because I think you're dead on. That's exactly right, and I want to try to square the circle, so to speak, of what we were talking about before, which is that
Yeah.
the idea that yes, while our classrooms are becoming more diverse in terms of sexual identity, in terms of sexuality, those types of things, that there are still research-based definitions, and definitions is not the right word, but categorical, statistical differences between what boys need at that age and what girls need at that age. But that's distinct from, or different from, and feel free to push back if this is not what you were saying, but that's different than sexuality or
Absolutely.
gender expression, those types of things, because it seems to me like that is a confusing aspect for some people when they hear that the lines between genders are not maybe as rigid as we thought, which some people think, well, that just means they don't exist. But there are
Right.
differences.
It's a diagram here that I love to show folks, and I'll share my screen. So you can put a link to this in the show notes. But basically, this is a diagram that shows us all of the different elements of gender and sexuality. So we tend to think of it as a very rigid thing. The whole world is divided into boys and girls, and boys like girls and girls like boys. And when I'm saying that gender is more complicated than that, I'm not saying that it doesn't exist. What I'm saying is that there are different elements to it. So, like you mentioned earlier, gender identity, that would be, what's up in your head. This is who I identify as. And I could identify as male or a boy. I could identify as female. There are now people who don't identify with any gender whatsoever, or people whose gender identity will change from day to day. That's separate from my gender expression, which is the things that I wear, how I walk, how I talk, how I choose to present myself. That's external, whereas my identity is internal.
Mm-hmm.
All of that is sometimes conflated with your sex assigned at birth, which would be the thing based on when you're born, what's between your legs. Your doctor decides for you, you're male, you're female, or you're intersex or other if you don't have the typical, genitalia that match one sex or the other. Um, but it can be tricky because sometimes I can be born with a certain set of sexual characteristics and they could misalign with my personal gender identity, and that's the cause of what's known as gender dysphoria, right? It's the incongruence of my physical form with who I feel I am on the inside.
Right.
All of that's completely separate from who you're physically and emotionally attracted to. So I could have all of these different things happening, but I could be attracted to someone of this gender or someone of that gender, or I could be attracted to someone's intelligence or something else. It's not that all of this is useless. It's that it's much more complicated than what we've been raised to believe.
Right.
And what we tend to focus to do, and what the research and pedagogical practices have trained us to do, is look only at this sex assigned at birth thing.
Yeah. Right.
And the fact is, there's so much more to it. At the same time, the human voice is largely sexually dimorphic.
Right.
So while we have this incredibly complex web of gender issues that we have to wrestle with, we also have to contend with the fact that cisgender males typically have a larynx that is about twice as large as their female peers, and that makes it fundamentally different. It's a cello versus a violin.
Right.
And that's a reality too. So, what I'm more interested in is finding ways to accept everyone and their gender, however they. What I'm more interested is finding ways to accept everyone, regardless of however they choose to interact with gender,
Right.
and help them learn to use their voice with the same level of um, technical dexterity and musical proficiency that they would with any other instrument.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think because I sing low does not necessarily mean I must be masculine. I think
Absolutely.
that's it's kind of a false equivalence.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think so earlier when we at the very beginning when we were talking about when I made the comment about 97% or so being identifying with some type of masculine characteristic, and you were talking about the Gallup poll with 5.5% or whatever LGBT. And I wanted to come back to that because it actually relates to the chart you just showed, which is that there are within that 5.5%, because I just pulled it up here and looked at that Gallup most recent Gallup thing of people who fall into the spectrum of LGBT. You have to also include a gay man, for example,
Yeah.
who is cisgendered and identifies with everything that is masculine, all the way
Right.
to, I would argue, and maybe this is where my lack of education comes in, even a trans boy who
Yeah.
is who is they're shooting for, and everything that they are working towards in their gender expression and their gender presentation is to be seen as one of the dudes. Like
Yeah.
they and so I have classes that include both of those. Like
Yep.
where that where you might have a cisgendered boy who is just like the bro of all bros on the football team, right next to a trans boy who is who maybe wants nothing more than to be one of the guys, right? And so, in my way of looking at it, both of those students and these hypothetical students identify with masculine characteristics. And
Sure.
so I think that it's to me that's where it kind of circling back to the finding out what makes that kid tick, that individual kid tick,
Yeah.
is that that there is like the chart I think was really beautiful how it explains that just that it's so complicated,
Yeah.
and the only way you're going to figure that out is by being like we said before, being a safe enough space for people to start to express themselves, hopefully through music.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I
So
think that's
go
the
ahead.
powerful thing about finding your voice
Mm-hmm.
is once you have it, you can use it to say or sing whatever you want. And I think that should be our goal as music educators rather than a performance or something. For me, the marker of my success as an educator is when someone walks away and they're more capable now as a
Yeah.
singer and a musician than they were before, because that enriches their life in ways that I could never choose for them.
Mm-hmm.
They will be able to do things now that I would never dream of.
Yeah. Now, speaking of dreams, what is your dream for this topic? In other words, we talked about repertoire a little bit. So, like, what are thoughts that you've come up with, or maybe even that you've written about that move towards solutions for these types of things?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things, ultimately, if we're taking like a big broad view, we don't even have a unified theory of how the human voice works yet, you know?
Mm.
But what we could use right now is a unified theory of the changing voice, because right now, the research that we have is very, very good for cisgender males. However, all of the research we have on the changing voice is frankly only by and large for cisgender males. And we know, based on the studies of like Lynn Gackle, for example, that female voices do in fact change, but we don't have a thorough enough uh, data to really understand how that works.
Yeah.
Not to mention addressing the needs of, like you talked about, all of our trans kids who do undergo the voice change. We could get into the weeds about AFAB and AMAB singers and how the gender transition can affect their voices. But basically, all of the things that we've talked about meeting your kids where they're at and listening to them and
Mm-hmm.
hearing where they are, it's like the universal design for learning. We make an accommodation for a specific type of kid. It actually ends up benefiting the entire class because there are other students who benefit from it in ways that we don't even understand,
Right.
right? When we listen to kids and we let them come in, and rather than saying, okay, you're a boy, so you're going to sit over there and you're going to sing bass, we go, hey, why don't you come over here? Just sing a little bit for me. We're going to find out what your lowest note, what your highest note is. We can do that with everyone.
Yeah.
We don't have to do it with just our male singers. And I think if we have a theory of that is the way we approach the voice and the changing voice, regardless of the sexual or the sexuality of a kid or their gender expression or whatever, we'll be in a much better place. Let's start with the voice of the student rather than the gender presentation of the student.
Right.
And we will get closer to where we want to be faster.
Absolutely. And I think it's, yes, and I think how we teach funny, it'll be 2 episodes in a row where universal design of learning has come up.
There you go.
But it's important because if I'm teaching my class that the voice of the student, the individual voice, the instrument inside of you is what determines what types of music or what line of the choir you will sing, those types of things. Well, that's already divorced from gender.
Yep.
In other words, it is your voice. Now, unfortunately, because of societal influences that the kids walk in the door with, there are already situations where kids have attached a gender to tenor or bass or soprano
Absolutely.
or alto.
They start attaching those things at like age 3, the research tells us.
Interesting.
Like that starts much younger than we could ever actually intervene.
Right. Yeah. Now
Yeah.
and I've run into that in unfortunate situations too with trans kids that are, where their voice doesn't sound like the gender that they are trying to express, and that makes a very difficult situation for us as choir directors because we have to balance, almost like weighing the scales between what is healthy for that student's voice and what is healthy for their mind and for their emotions. And so I've always found that the best way to deal with this, again, I'm going to sound like a broken record, is try to get to know that kid, establish trust to the point where you can have a conversation. You can.
Well, I think absolutely. It's really important to have that conversation, especially when you're talking about kids who are dealing with, reconciling their gender identity. That's a really, really tough place to be. So you're absolutely right, I think, to meet them in a place of listening first.
Yep.
and trying to prescribe last. I think pedagogically, we can counter this narrative of masculine equals low, big, loud, feminine equals high, soft, weak.
Yeah.
By just teaching all of our students, regardless of how high or low they sing, to explore the full range of colors of their voice.
Mm-hmm.
So I always say, I'm a grown man with a beard. If I can go, and make all these really high falsetto noise, absolutely, so can you.
Yeah.
And I can make growly, ugly sounds, and I can do everything in between.
Yep.
And teaching kids, oh, I can do that too. Suddenly they become less self-conscious about their voice, and they start to become more interested in what they can actually do with the full range of colors.
Yeah.
And you can celebrate anybody who can do anything cool. And that's much more empowering.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I would typically describe myself as everything that is stereotypical about masculine, with the exception of the fact that I sing alto in a choir a lot, because I'm a falsettist, and also that I like poetry and stuff. But other than that, like, it's all masculine. And so by showing that, I found that that's actually a pretty good tool for me to connect with boys and to degenderify, which is that a word? I don't know. To degenderify the concept of singing high
Yeah.
or the concept of singing low even, because
Yeah.
it's about mastering the instrument, as you said. Like, we want you to know all the colors, all the shapes, all the sizes that your
Mm-hmm.
voice can do, and by doing that, I think you start to uh, almost, I don't know, I dream a dream of a time when we could make it so that kids don't even have to think about how the sounds they make attached to a gender.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
because like gender is something else. Like, that's something maybe we could have a choir that's just not an that's not an issue.
Yeah.
That's
I mean, yeah, I think you're always going to have like an element of gender in everything that we do, whether
hmm
you're talking about working with individual singers or the repertoire that we choose or how we talk about recruiting. However, it's the realization that just because we need more tenors and basses, that doesn't mean we have to do X, Y, and Z and pander to ideas of gender, because really what that's doing is it's putting another barrier in the way
right.
for the stuff that we actually care about.
Yep.
What we care about is the music, and we care about kids. And I think when we have a program that puts those things first, the 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 gender disparity things, they tend to just kind of fall by the wayside, because if they see what's happening is cool, that's way more interesting. They want to be where the cool things and the good things are happening.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden they won't care about those old things. They'll be like, oh well, look, there's the guy on the football team, and there's the guy I saw at the art exhibit, and there's the lead in the school play, and they're all in the choir,
Right.
and there's a place for all of them there.
Yes. Yeah, that's what it's all about. And I think that I think the temptation probably in what you're describing of pandering to a stereotype is that many teachers probably see that as the quickest way to get more kids, because
Sure.
they're pandering to a majority. The
I'm
problem,
saying if you're gonna pander to kids, better to do it with food. Like,
oh yeah,
that is more universally beloved, I
right.
think.
Yeah, and I think that part of the reason that it's seen that way is that I think it's not even that the boys want to be pandered to in that way. I think what's unfortunate is that we're also being kind of playing. There's two sides of a coin happening here, where the boys feel pressure themselves to show that they are that stereotype of masculinity, even if they're not.
Right.
And so by pandering to it, it just kind of um, it perpetuates that pressure,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
cycle, which I think is in a lot of ways is one of the great things about choral music, is because if it's done as it sounds like you and I are kind of dancing around a lot of agreement here of what we think should be happening, of where
Yeah.
there's got to be a place where the kid brings their voice as their primary contribution, and not
Yep.
whether or not they fit into some type of a mold.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think you and I are in agreement. But I mean, there the fact is, I remember growing up and singing, like there's a poster that says like real men sing, and it's literally a caveman with like a club and long shaggy hair. And I thought, what is this saying? Who is this? The person that we want cavemen in our choirs? Or this is the type of singing that we do? Like, what does that even mean?
Yeah.
And yet I don't know if you've ever seen that poster, but I remember it being really big
I
when I was
I
coming up,
probably
growing up in
have. I
the
probably
60s and
have, but
70s.
in fact, let's finish with that. That with that concept of real men sing, because I know you mentioned that
Yeah.
to me before, in when you sent me a message, and that intrigued me because uh, again, I think that might be the quintessential example of what you've been talking about for the last hour, which is
Yeah.
pandering to a stereotype.
Yeah.
Because it presupposes, if you say real men sing and you make a poster, it presupposes that there is an agreed upon definition of what real men is.
That is
So who are we talking
exactly
to?
it.
Who are we talking to?
Exactly.
hmm
Exactly.
Yeah.
And anytime you use that phrase real men sing, you're saying there's such a thing as a real man. And we don't know exactly what that definition is, but we know that there's going to be people on the inside of it, and there's going to be people on the outside of it.
Right.
And if I believe that choirs for all people, then I don't want anybody on the outside.
Right.
I want everybody to feel that they sing. So I don't think real men sing. I think real people sing, because to sing is to understand the full depth of your humanity and to be able to express and interact with that in a beautiful way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I'm kind of a nerd like this, but I think that there's nothing wrong per se um, with coming up with a definition of what it means to you for someone to be a man. However, there has to be some type of a nuance involved where you would have to recognize that someone else has a definition of what it means to be a man too, and it might
Hmm.
not be the same as yours. And so if
Exactly.
you're going to be, and that's true of any word, by the way, like men or women or any other category that we put on ourselves, we're going to have our own concept. For example, I have a sense of what it means for me to be a man,
Hmm.
but I have no way of knowing what, or I would never dream of trying to preach to you what your definition of being a man should be.
Exactly.
Um,
Exactly.
and so I think that's an important distinction, is that we can make space in our choir rehearsals for men and boys and people who have some type of a male identity. I think where we have to be careful, this is just my opinion, we have to be careful about trying to decide what those boundaries are for others.
Right. Right. And in the repertoire that we choose, be careful, uh, and look at the messages
Mm-hmm.
that are in there as well, because I mean, looking at the stuff that I did in my dissertation, like, there's some texts out there and some really well-known pieces of repertoire that are pretty misogynistic.
Oh yeah.
There's None of Us Cared for Kate in that great Laura Farnell set, Songs of Road and Sea. I love every other song in that set, but that last one, it's not her fault, it's Shakespeare, right? But the whole song is about, there's all these sailors on the wharf, and we like all these different women, but none of us like Kate because Kate doesn't give us the time of the day, and so
Uh-huh.
we hate her.
Right.
And all right, Shakespeare, okay, but what does that message say? If we end up performing that song because it's fun and upbeat, and we like the boisterous nature of it, what messages are we internalizing at the same time because of that
Right.
text? And it's not a question of you've got to throw the baby out with the bathwater and we've got to start completely over, but we need to just look carefully at what we do and think, what are we actually teaching our kids?
Mm-hmm.
Because there's music out there that meets our kids' needs musically, and will also speak to the things that we actually want to teach them, as far as like how to be a good human in the world.
Uh-huh.
And those should be the things that we strive to program, I think.
Right. Did you ever come across the one called "Man is for the Woman Made"? It's it,
uh,
it's a big yikes.
well, yeah, I mean, we're in a period right now, like I think every generation does, where we have to reckon with what's come before us
Uh-huh.
and choose what we're going to keep and what we're going to discard. Um, and I think another thing that we haven't really talked about on here is this idea that what's acceptable in one place is not necessarily going to be acceptable in another.
Yes.
So what I do with my students who are living and working in, you know, a small town where there's one high school, um, I'm going to do something different than if I'm working at the School for the Performing Arts in the big city. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not that one thing is good or bad, but if you're meeting your kids where they're at, then well, those two places, they're going to be different. They're going to be
Yeah.
different,
Yep.
and we have to be okay with that.
Not to mention
But always centering on that human element
yeah, and of course
of
cultures around the planet too have very different
yeah,
ideas about this topic. So,
yes.
and of course, if you teach in an area that might have immigrant students or even refugee students, like I've had before, from different places that might have a completely different cultural frame of reference for every single thing we just talked about for the
Hmm.
last hour. And so those are again, part of being inclusive includes those kids too.
Yeah.
And the kids in rural America and the kids in the big city, and it's starting where they are, like you said, and building from there, which is wonderful. Well, Braden, this was fun. I really enjoyed this. Well, I'm going to give you the last word. Things that we maybe on this topic or any other that we just need to kind of take away from this conversation? What's your best advice?
Best advice is to just, I don't know, we've done it, we've been saying it all time, the whole episode, meet your kids where they're at. Don't make decisions about repertoire before you know what your kids can do and who they are.
Yeah.
And that's true whether you're talking about, we're talking about the ranges of the music that they sing, the difficulty of the music that they sing. Know what's going on before you pick your music, because it's much, much easier to find a puzzle piece that fits in the whole than to try and scramble something together and you find out all these things that I picked, they don't work for one reason or another. If you start with that, then you'll be in good shape.
Awesome. That's great. Now, I know you're a composer as well, and I'm assuming that do you have some stuff that people could find for adolescent boys' voices?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's a big part of what I do. That's why I started writing. Now I
Okay.
do a lot more than that, but that was what initially started.
Okay. So some of that maybe at Music Spoke. I know you've got some stuff there.
Yeah, musicspoke.com is one of my main distributors. When is this going to air?
Pretty quick.
Pretty quick.
Yep.
Okay, yeah. Well, my website is getting updated.
Okay.
My goal is to have it completely finished by the end of the school year, so people will be able to buy my music via JW Pepper or Music Spoke, which they already can. But soon my website's going to be updated to have a whole bunch of brand newly edited scores as well, where people can buy not just individual octavos but reproducible PDFs.
Awesome.
As well.
Yeah, and when the cool thing about about shows like this is that people tend to look at podcasts not necessarily right when they come out, but just they'll search topically about things. So just whenever you get that ready, just send it to me and I'll just add it to your page on the website and link it to that. So for now, I'll link to Music Spoke and I'll link to your social media and to
I'll link to my website. It's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
That works too.
Yeah.
That'll be great. Well, thank you so much, Braeden.
Thanks so much for having me, Chris. This was really great. I hope we get to talk again sometime.
Sounds good. That's going to be great.
All right.
I'll be in touch.
Yeah.
Bye. Thank you all for sticking around to the end of an episode. I'm sure you found that episode encouraging and thought-provoking. I know I did, and I really appreciate those of you who stick around all the way to the end of conversations, because that's what we are here. We are conversation activists. I encourage you to share it, comment, like, subscribe, whatever it is that helps drive the algorithm, and I'll give you a hint. That's interaction. The more you interact, the more people see the show. So I appreciate your help with that. And of course, join the Patreon at patreon.com/Choralosophy, as well as use the checkout code at ryanmain.com, at graphitepublishing.com, at My Music Folders, Sight Reading Factory. These are great ways to get great choral products at a discount, and it helps me out a lot for them to know that you're listening. Thanks, everybody.